So just a little bit of a kind of way that we like to think about the world. And I give credit to this to Brita O'Keefe and Lindsay Fallon, who I've worked with in the past, who really argue that culture, whatever the size of the group is, be it the Little League team, be it that hate group, be it the school, be it the Little League, be it the PBIS membership, it's a group of individuals. And they are defined by what they say and what they do. And they have a shared learning history. When you walk away from this forum, you will have experienced a series of events that have been shared by all of us. And you will verbalize and act upon that experience. And that experience will either differentiate you from one group or will cause you to be overlapping with another group. And it will predict how you behave in the future. So any kind of group, any kind of culture is going to be defined by that learning history, which is sort of the way I like to think about it. Does it change over time? Absolutely. Can it become stronger or better? Can it be weakened? Can it be pro-social versus anti-social? Absolutely. But I want us to think about the importance of our experiences as we move through our different learning environments, our families, our communities, our schools, and the impact it has. Now, what I want to do for the next 3 or 4 minutes is to describe for you a way to think about your learning environment. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit about me, and I don't want you to think about me. I want you to think about yourself. And I'm going to share with you a series of event circles around this big circle, and I want you to start filling in your circles as I go around it. Because I want to argue that my learning history predicts how I'm going to behave in the future. And some of that is something I'm very aware of, and some of it I'm not aware of. But the fact that I respond in certain kinds of contexts suggests that that history has an impact on how I behave. Sometimes it's pro-social, sometimes it's anti-social. So just bear with me a little bit as I walk through this, and I'll go through it fairly quickly. So as Lucille indicated to you, in a couple ways. One is I'm an old guy. I was born in 1951, and I was born in Santa Cruz, California. So I'm a Californian by birth, and I grew up there. My parents, who are Japanese Americans, were born in Watsonville, California. And I'm what's called a sansei. I'm a third generation Japanese American, and my parents are Nisei, they're second generation. And my grandparents are called Issei, they're first generation, and they came over from Japan and became citizens when they got here. I grew up in California, in Santa Cruz, and in Los Gatos, California. I grew up in an environment where my parents raised me as a Buddhist. I learned a lot about Buddhism during that time. However, I struggled with going to Sunday school because I'd much rather play baseball than that. And I became much more involved in Little League Baseball during that time. In 1942, my mother was interned or incarcerated in prison camps in California. She was one of 110,000 Japanese Americans who were told to go to camp, not summer camp, but to incarceration camp, because they were Japanese American and were viewed as a threat because of World War II and the start of the war with Japan. And my mother spent 2.5 years behind barbed wire. My dad and his family moved to Utah because you could move inland and away from the coast to a neutral, supportive state. As a result of that experience for my family, my mother and my father in particular, my aunts and uncles and so forth, as for going to camp to be in prison for 2.5 years, when they had us, my sister and I, as kids, they just made a decision, conscious, unconscious, whatever, to make sure that we would fit in to American culture. We didn't learn to speak Japanese after that. We started eating with forks and knives instead of with hashi or chopsticks. We started referring to we stopped referring to shoyu, instead referred to soy sauce. They wanted us to become more American because being Japanese resulted in this exclusion and this imprisonment. As a result, I went to primarily white high school. My parents made the decision to move to Los Gatos, because that was where they could provide opportunities for my sister and I to be more successful And I went to a high school of, in my senior class had, I think, 400 people, 500 kids in it. And there were 2 Japanese Americans, and there was 1 African American who was a foreign exchange student. So I grew up in a community that was not very diverse. My biggest struggle during that time, which was 1964 through 69, was about where am I going to lean? Because if you think about the 60s, that was the time during the Vietnam War protests, during the kind of the flower child environments. And my biggest struggle during that time, frankly, was am I going to lean towards the Stones or am I going to lean towards the Beatles? Fascinating thing about being a Japanese American in this particular school environment is my best friends, Dale, Jim, Lansing, Molly, Roger, were all white. You know, Lansing was a Chinese American. He came a little bit later. He was one of my buddies. But Molly was a white girl. Now, Molly's in quotes because at the time, I sort of had a crush on Molly. But the problem is that Molly was white. And my parents weren't quite ready to go that far with me being more white, more American. And that wasn't encouraged. So I always kind of adored, if you will, or watched Molly from afar because that was not quite, my parents weren't quite ready to reinforce that kind of relationship yet. Again, part of their learning experience affected how they raised me and affected how I responded. I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara for my undergraduate degree. My undergraduate degree was in botany, so I was an environmentalist at the time. Good or bad, the Vietnam War protests were at their height. I became heavily influenced by sort of the counterculture. I watched them burn the Bank of America down as part of the protests. I didn't light the match, but I watched it burn down. There were experiences happening at that time that approximated what's going on now. And that learning experience at the University of California, Santa Barbara and Goleta and Isla Vista affects how I respond to what's going on contemporarily now. But was fascinating kind of experience. As a botany major, because that was my major in my undergraduate degrees in biology or botany, one of my summer activities was to become a summer camp counselor. And I became a summer camp counselor in an Easter seal camp. And in that experience, I learned about kids with multiple disabilities. And I decided at that point that I was going to become a special educator. So I went to the University of Washington, got my my teaching degree and my master's degree in special ed. And my advisor at the time, Rick Neal, introduced me to a kid by the name of Gary. And Gary taught me how to blow up toilets. And Gary was a kid who was in a lockdown facility for kids with emotional behavioral disorders and had broken the law. And the way you blow up toilets, by the way, is to light the fuse on an M80, drop it in, count to 3, and then flush. It's pretty phenomenal. But at that time, I learned, 1974, that I really wanted to work with kids who had emotional behavioral disorders. And that's sort of where my career shifted. I worked in a number of states. Each of those states had an effect on how I viewed the world, how I thought about special ed, how I thought about myself as a Japanese American, and so forth. It's a really great experience to spend different time in those places, just because it really pushes that sort of learning history and shapes where it goes. I am very lucky. I am married to a person who is white Hispanic. I'm in a biracial marriage. Her name is Betsy Fernandez. She's a school principal, or was a school principal. And now, finally, I'm in a biracial relationship. My parents have finally kind of loosened up around that idea, and it's great. We have 2 kids who are called Hapa or Hafu. Some of you know my daughter, who is Reiko Elizabeth Sugai Fernandez, and my son, who is Kyoshi Kane Sugai Fernandez. We use the Mexican or tradition, if you will, to put the male's name first in the hyphenation. And my wife wanted Japanese names for our first name. So the idea is to allow our kids to be able to get into any job or any any college that they wanted to, just based on their name, which is sort of why we did that approach, sort of. Now I'm retired, and now I have a grandson. And my grandson was born in June of 2020. And all of a sudden, my priorities have become much more, or my professional priorities have become much more focused, because my grandson, our grandson, is now going to have to grow up in the culture, the climate that we are creating right now. And so my investments, my outcomes are significantly more important to me. Now, again, I don't care that you kind of identify with any of the particulars of that circle. What I care about is that you put your critical events, those critical experiences, those critical kind of life experiences that have shaped who you are. Because who you are will affect how you engage in your profession, work as a team member, make selections of interventions, make decisions on how you interpret the data, have an impact on how you interact with a kid, how you respond to what's happening in social media and so forth. And we've got to be really careful about that, because our learning history sometimes may not be as equitable and just as it should be for the climates and the individuals that are involved. Now, the reason again I did this is because one of your homework assignments is to do this and to submit it to Brian.